Right, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on the reuse of historic buildings with our speakers Adam Partington, Sarah Harrison and John Millhouse. My name's Lynette Swinburne, I work for Savills and I'm here today as a representative of the East Midlands RTPI. I've had the privilege of working across a number of historic environments in my career, and so I'm very interested in this session that we're having today. A few housekeeping points before we start to help you get the most out of the session. All attendees have been muted. If you've got any questions for either myself or for the speakers, then please send it via the question box in your GoToWebinar toolbar. It might be on the right-hand side or on the top of your screen. The speakers' presentations will run for approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for some questions and answers after that. I'll pick a few questions from those that come in. Unfortunately, we might not have time to answer them all in the time available, but we will do our best. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the RTPI's YouTube channel after the event. If you personally lose connection whilst we're in the session, then please try rejoining using the link that was originally sent out to you from GoToWebinar. If any of the speakers should happen to lose connectivity, then please stay in the webinar, but keep an eye on your emails in case we need to send out a link to relaunch the session. I'm pleased to hand over to our first speaker, Adam Partington, who's going to be talking to us about the legislation, policy and guidance around the reuse of historic buildings. So over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Lynette, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to Lynette and also to the team at the RTPI for the chance to speak today, and also for giving me the glamorous slot of legislation, policy and guidance. We're a development-led heritage planning consultancy based up in the East Midlands, and much of our work is bringing development and heritage assets together to secure them sustainable, viable future uses. And the toolkit of legislation, policy and guidance is pretty fundamental in how we achieve this. So no doubt that's why I've been afforded the privilege. So I'm going to press on. There's a good amount for us to get through today, and I'm going to try and keep to time. So first and foremost, there's a lot to think about when it comes to thinking about the prevailing framework of legislation and policy, and of course, how we apply that using the guidance and advice available to us. And I think it's true to say it can feel like a bit of an uphill struggle that's more geared towards resisting negative impacts of development than it is in securing sustainable uses. But actually, when we look closely, there's a lot of positive messages within both the legislation and the policy and the underpinning guidance and advice. Fortunate for you all, I'm not going to go through things paragraph by paragraph, but instead I'm going to look at how we interpret some of the semantics and some of the words about bringing change to historic buildings through the development system and also the listed building consent regime. You'll notice that I skip through one or two slides quickly at times. That's because there's links and resources available to you should you wish to download or look at them later. So we can see the core pieces of legislation, policy and guidance just here at the moment on screen. Town and Country Planning Act, of course, defining what's development and what isn't, and that's fairly important in terms of what's enacted and what's not. And the Planning Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act 1990, then the NPPF, local policy and plans, of course, which I won't really be touching on today, and a whole sort of gamut of planning instruments, local listed building consent orders, LDOs, which again, I won't be covering in too much detail today, but it's worth looking into. There's a lot of different tools at our disposal. And then the guidance and advice, namely the PPG, which I'll be touching on in a little bit of detail later on, and any national and local advice that's available. But I thought I'd start off looking at what we mean by the terms conservation, because after all, the reuse of historic buildings is all sort of centered around this idea that we are going to conserve heritage assets. And the NPPF gives us a really good definition of what conservation is. And that's surprisingly, in some respects, the process of maintaining and managing change. So change here is at the heart of conservation. But there's a couple of other words in there that I'd like to pick up on as we go on. It's changed to a heritage asset that sustains and, where appropriate, enhances its significance. So what do we mean by sustain? Essentially, what we're looking at is preserving, doing no harm to our heritage asset, retaining the heritage asset, retaining elements of interest, and affording it a continued use. So that's what we mean by sustaining. In terms of enhancing, well, our options broaden, but in many respects, when we're dealing with sensitive historic fabric, we might not want that fabric to change at all. So enhancing it can be quite difficult. And actually what we're looking to do is improve existing fabric, improve the prospects of that fabric being retained, remove poor quality fabric, perhaps old repairs, restore where we can, if we need to, maintain and afford new uses where our heritage assets are lacking a use, a viable use. So that's what we mean by enhancement. And we're doing this to significance. What makes a heritage asset, in this case of this webinar, historic buildings, what makes them interesting, what makes them valued? And I'll look at a couple of frameworks for discussing significance. And then, of course, if you like, the thing that's driving this is change. And that could be development under the Town and Country Planning Act. But remember, we're dealing with listed buildings as well in many instances here. And actually, it doesn't have to be development to require listed building consent. It can be any works that alter or extend the character of listed buildings. So we may need two consents here, listed building consent and planning permission. So I'm going to look at each of these in turn, and then we're going to move on through the legislation towards the end and the policy at the end of the presentation. But I think it's absolutely fair to say that before we even look or consider reusing heritage assets, the first step in that process is to understand what's significant about our building and how significant it is. And there are several different frameworks for articulating this. The one that the legislation uses and the policy uses are the NPPF heritage interests. So pretty simple really, as they sound: architectural, historic, archaeological, and artistic. And we want to find out about those four particular elements of any heritage asset in detail before we start thinking about sustainable reuses of historic buildings. What I'd also say, and hopefully will come across during the presentation, is that we need to look beyond the building as well. So the building has its innate values, the fabric of the building, the history of the building, but how that is experienced within broader places and sometimes within its setting is absolutely crucial. Thinking about the contribution a building or a heritage asset makes in social, environmental, and economic terms to place shaping is the way to bring sustainable reuses to heritage assets. If we treat them in isolation, they tend to be money pits, and they sit a bit irksome amongst other planning policies and bringing about change. So it's really looking at what the building can do for wider places. A couple of resources there on that slide for you to have a look at. Other frameworks for assessing significance. The Historic England Conservation Principles is a good one, currently under review. The British Standards, if you're looking at quite a lot of technical detail, and it is particularly geared towards buildings. So if you do want the detail, take a look at that. IHBC guidance, that's the Institute of Historic Building Conservation, and some of the good practice guidance from Historic England. Okay, when we're looking at historic buildings, we tend to focus, not exclusively, but we tend to focus on two particular elements, two particular interests. The first is architectural interest, and as defined here by the NPPF, that's the design and general aesthetics of a building or a place arising from a conscious design or fortuitously over time. Excuse me. Architectural interest, some useful words here, is in the art or the science of design, its construction, craftsmanship, and decoration of buildings and structures of all types. So it's really the architectural presence, the look, the engineering, the design, the whole concept behind why something has appeal or elicits a reaction from us. In terms of historic interest, it can be broken down into two particular elements, illustrative or associative. So it could be illustrative of a past life or event, or it could be associated with a particularly famous person or individual or event. Generally speaking, they need to be relate to our nation's history, but they could also have local historic interest. I picked a couple of examples here. It's actually just one example on the right-hand side, which is a very good and sustainable reuse of a historic shopfront in the Art Nouveau style. This is a Grade 2 star listed building in Nottingham. And below we can see a historic picture, and you can just about make out that this is one of the Boots original stores, a Nottingham-based company. So Jesse Boot was responsible for this, obviously become one of the forerunners and the most principal chemists in the world, and so therefore has associative interest to that end. So it's really important that we get to understand the architectural and historic interest of our buildings before we start creating plans and considering what a use might be. In terms of significance as well, we're probably going to come across historic buildings in the planning process in 4 different ways. Listed buildings, I imagine, is the one that most people come into contact with most frequently, and they are specifically designated under law for their architectural and historic interest. They have 3 grades, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Grade 2, which is special architectural historic interest, and they're about 92% of the 500,000 listed buildings that we have in the country. Grade 2 star, more than special architectural and historic interest, about 6.8%, and then grade 1 is exceptional architectural and historic interest, just 1.2% of those 500,000 buildings. So you should always be very focused when you're looking at listed buildings, no doubt, but you can see now that if you're dealing with a grade 2 star or a grade 1, you're in the very top end and the top proportion of listed buildings. We also have a great number of conservation areas in the country, and they are designated for their character and appearance. But their character and appearance is precious because it's derived from their architectural and historic interest, which is desirable to preserve and enhance under the legislation. Thirdly, we've got non-designated heritage assets, which are generally locally listed, or they might be landmarks identified in a local plan or other document. And of course, neighbourhood plans can identify non-designated heritage assets. They carry a degree of weight in the planning process, but certain legislation and certain policy does not apply, and it can be a bit of a complex area. So I'll try and get onto that shortly. And then finally, World Heritage Sites. They are designated for their outstanding universal value. They meet some very high criteria set out by UNESCO. And buildings or built structures can be an attribute, something that conveys a sense of that outstanding universal value, and therefore our heritage assets and their uses need to be considered in respect of that contribution. Just to make things easy for you, of course, designations can overlap, so we can have a listed building within a conservation area within a World Heritage Site. And it's important to understand all the different regimes and the different designations that apply, because they enact different parts of policy, and also we're looking at the cumulative impact of our reuse. So to reuse a building in a conservation area that's a listed building, we're bringing about benefit both to the conservation area and of course to the listed building itself. So worth understanding which different regimes apply. I'm going to touch very briefly on this piece of guidance, Managing Significance and Decision Taking, GPA 2, produced by Historic England. It sets out a really useful structure for us to look at significance, which is the nature, the level and extent of significance. The nature is the architectural, the artistic, the historical or the archaeological interest, essentially. The level is, in simple terms, is grade 1, grade 2 star or grade 2. How important is it? And then the third one, very important, extent. Not all parts of a listed building or a conservation area are necessarily going to have a high level of significance, and some parts may have none. So understanding which parts of a heritage asset are significant and which parts are less significant or don't have any significance helps us target development and understand where change can most easily be accommodated and how use particularly can be facilitated. So it's absolutely fundamental, again, within this statement of significance that we produce, that we understand the nature, level and extent of significance. Really good document, GPA 2. I suggest having a look at it. It's not particularly long and it's very straightforward. In terms of understanding our building, we need to understand what it needs, what its condition is in, and what potential uses it might be put to in a viability terms. And the PPG sets out a little bit of guidance here: early appraisals, conservation plans, specialist investigation, whatever we need to can help identify constraints and opportunities for development to engage with. Appraisals or investigations can identify alternative development options, more sensitive options, for example, that conserve heritage assets and deliver public benefits. So it's really talking about how we sweat heritage assets and put them to use in places here. That's what it's teeing up. A couple of useful resources and web links for you there. I'm not going to go over those. We also looked at change within the definition, the NPPF definition of conservation, and it's worth just sort of stressing that change and impact takes 3 different forms and sits in 2 loose camps. Impact of change can be positive, it can be neutral, and at times, of course, it could be negative, or what we typically term as harm. And those impacts can sit in 2 camps, as I suggest. Direct impacts, which is where we're knocking a chip off a listed building, or we're demolishing an element of it, or perhaps we're reorganizing it internally away from its historic plan form. That would be negative direct impacts. So a positive direct impact would be to preserve the listed building, preserve a use, maintain it. Negative would be alterations, extensions, and demolition that detract from its character. So those are direct impacts. But we also have indirect impacts, which is where we change the experience of a heritage asset from within its setting. Typically that's associated with views. So do we improve or obscure a view and its extent? But it can do sort of anything to do with the senses. So perhaps if we put a chicken farm next to a registered park and garden, and we bring a bit of smell and noise in there, that's going to change our experience of the park and garden's significance. It also relates to our ability to access physically and mentally the significance of heritage assets, and cognitively so. So our knowledge and understanding, will it improve that? Will development do that, or will it withhold it? And in which case it would be harmful. So direct and indirect impacts, and they can take positive, neutral, or negative forms. And I mentioned harm just there. Of course, that's not in the definition of conservation in the NPPF. That's the one thing we're trying to avoid. So in simple terms, harm means not conserving. We're not preserving, or we're not enhancing those elements of a building, in this case, that are significant, that have architectural and historic interest. And what we know from the NPPF policy is any harm, no matter how small it is, to a designated heritage asset should require clear and convincing justification. And for that, you need a heritage impact assessment or a planning statement setting out the gains and the harms, and why a proposed reuse is supportive in planning and legislative terms. Harm sits in 2 broad camps: substantial harm and less than substantial harm. Taking substantial harm first, so paragraphs 194 and 195 of the NPPF, this is an incredibly high level test. It's relatively rare in development terms, and it's approaching near to or complete loss of a heritage asset. We're essentially talking about tearing out the beating heart of a listed building or a heritage asset, or something that makes it significant, and just leaving a shell behind, few legacies of what's important. We know within the policy that any substantial harm to grade 2 listed buildings or grade 2 heritage assets should be exceptional, and to grade 1 and grade 2 stars should be wholly exceptional. That's the specific wording. So there's a very strong resistance here. If we're looking for sustainable reuse of heritage assets, it's very unlikely that we'll be heading in for substantial harm as part of that process. Importantly, that harm, substantial harm, can be direct or indirect. So if a heritage asset enjoys a view to such a strong degree and we cut off that view, that could be substantial harm. In terms of less than substantial harm, it's a very, very broad definition. It can again be direct or indirect. And in a lot of heritage impact assessments and appraisals, people do tend to break things down into sort of low, medium, and high degrees of less than substantial harm. It's a bit wordy. Case currently suggests that, well, one inspector suggests that you shouldn't do it, and it's just one generic field, less than substantial harm. Other practitioners do go with a low, medium, and high approach, or something similar. We tend to use it, but we tend to put in a rationale, a clearly worded rationale for why it might be low, medium, and try and offer some clarity to why a degree of harm is being experienced by a heritage asset. Little bit of a catch here, which and a bit of a trap that I've seen many people fall into. The test for substantial versus less than substantial harm does not apply to non-designated heritage assets. They are assessed according to paragraph 197 of the MPPF, and paragraphs 194 through 196 apply only to designated heritage assets. Okay, so a little bit more detail now on some of the individual elements of the legislation and policy. Section 7, essentially, of the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act, which is a primary piece of legislation for listed buildings and conservation areas. Section 7 essentially puts in the consent regime for listed buildings. So consent will be required for demolition of a listed building, its alteration, its extension, in any manner that would affect its character as a building of special architectural and historic interest. And those works must be authorised through the consent process. Then there's two sections, section 16 and 66, which control listed building consent and planning permission in respect to the preservation of listed buildings. And in determining those applications for LBC or planning, a local authority is to have special regard to the desirability of preserving the building or its setting and any features of architectural and historic interest. Note there that actually the legislation extends to the architectural and historic fabric of the building, but also how it's experienced from within its setting. And that's a key part of section 16 and 66. So setting of heritage assets, listed buildings, is a matter of legislation. And so it weighs very, very heavily under Barnwell, considerable weight, Barnwell Manor, I should say, case, considerable weight in the planning process. Section 16 and 66 and 7, of course, extend to the curtilage of listed buildings. And just for the sake of clarity, a listed building is listed inside and out if it's of architectural or historic interest. Section 72 requires local planning authorities to pay special attention to the desirability of preserving and enhancing the character and appearance of a conservation area. One thing just to notice here is we've gone from preserving in section 16 and 66 to preserving and enhancing. So the legislation is already beginning to tell us that we're preempting change within conservation areas, development within conservation areas that can enhance the character and appearance of that area. With listed buildings, it's a little stricter. It's just about preserving within the legislation, but the policy broadens that interpretation up. Again, a little pitfall with this act, it applies solely to listed buildings and conservation areas. We had a planning appeal dismissed recently on the grounds that using this act, the inspector used this specific act on the grounds of the setting of a scheduled monument. That is covered, the setting of conservation areas and scheduled monuments and any other heritage assets other than listed buildings is covered under paragraphs 194 through 196 of the National Planning Policy Framework. This piece of legislation only applies to listed buildings and conservation areas. Okay, so to the policy. Paragraphs 194 through 197 essentially tackle harm brought about by development to designated and in 197 non-designated heritage assets, and we've just touched on those a little bit earlier. But looking to sort of beyond that and more broadly within the chapter, we can see that actually it begins to set a very positive role for development in the reuse and conservation of heritage assets. We know that high degrees of weight, considerable weight, need to be put onto heritage assets and their conservation because they are an irreplaceable resource as per paragraph 184 and should be conserved in a manner appropriate to their significance, the nature, level and extent of that significance. Paragraphs 184, 185 and 192 emphasise the beneficial role that heritage assets can make to distinctive places, to quality of life and to wider social, cultural and economic agenda. And it's that part of the policy which I feel is generally very, very underrepresented in how we plan and how we develop. So your planning appraisals, your planning statements, your heritage impact assessments should be engaging ideally with the cultural, the economic and the environmental benefits that heritage bring. I'll touch on that just on the next slide. 184 to 196, just below there, recognises the need for viable uses consistent with conservation. So we need to bring use to heritage assets. So it's a good thing to do that. And paragraph 197 tackles non-designated heritage assets, and they require balanced judgment to be made regards the extent and degree of harm versus the significance of that particular non-designated heritage asset. When we're considering about the benefits that development can bring or change can bring to heritage assets, as I said, it's really important to flag up the social, the cultural, environmental and economic gains that heritage assets can bring, and actually rejuvenated heritage assets can bring to places. And Historic England have been doing a lot of work on this over the past decade or more, and they bring out these fantastic publications, 3 of which I've selected here, and there's a link to go to the Heritage Counts part of their website. And this spells out in pounds, shillings and pence in terms of volunteer and mental health benefits and physical health benefits, in terms of environmental benefits. It spells out what historic buildings can do, what heritage assets can do. And we tend to reference these as often as we possibly can within our reports. They provide a great insight in terms of how to secure a use and what benefits that will bring to place shaping. Chapter 16, just moving on a few more key points there, and looking at the more positive elements, is actively telling us to seek opportunities to better reveal and enhance the significance of areas or the setting of heritage assets. Again, it tends to focus on area-based designations and the experiential qualities of setting rather than the individual listed buildings themselves. So paragraph 200, local planning authorities actively to look for development within the setting of heritage assets, within World Heritage Sites and conservation areas that reveal significance and preserve those elements of setting. And they should be treated, where they achieve this application, should be treated favourably in the planning balance. Just before we move on to the planning policy guidance, enabling development is obviously a tool that you can use. I'm not going to spend too much time. It's just to flag up that there is some recent guidance produced by Historic England here. It really hinges on the conservation deficit of a building. That's the amount by which the cost of repair and securing an optimal viable use for a building exceeds the market value on completion of the repair and conservation works. So there has to be a conservation deficit, and you have to go through quite a rigmarole to put enabling development together. But essentially, you can use development that ordinarily wouldn't be permissible in planning terms to the benefit of a heritage assets conservation. So development within green belts in the setting of heritage assets or something like that, which can then raise funding to go into a primary heritage asset. Now onto the PPG, recently revised July 2019, just over a year ago, and it offers certain aspects of clarity in the interpretation and application of policy, usefully so, I think, in terms of bringing development and heritage assets together. And it recognises that conservation is an active process, and it's all about getting the best out of assets and what they can do to places. It also puts a lot more recognition on the public benefits of maintaining and securing sustainable futures for heritage assets. I think that was particularly unclear before. We're going to look at some of the paragraphs in detail in a moment. And a greater emphasis on the viability of establishing uses for buildings, including their economic considerations, recognising there actually might be more than one optimal viable use, whereas before we tended to sort of major on just one viable use that development should investigate. And it also puts on a requirement for local planning authorities to identify non-designated heritage assets up front and give reasons. Just a couple of the paragraphs, hopefully I'm fairly on time. But in the case of buildings, generally the risks of neglect and decay are resisted through active use, consistent with conservation. And key piece of the policy guidance here, listed buildings, heritage assets are likely to require sympathetic changes from time to time. I'm going to skip through this a little bit. If there are a range of alternative uses, then the optimal viable use is the one that will bring the least harm to the significance of the heritage asset. And the optimal viable use is not necessarily going to be the most economically favourable one. Public benefits, anything that delivers economic, social, environmental benefits under NPPF paragraph 8. They need to be of a scale to be the benefit to the public at large and not just private benefit. However, an example is given to say that works to a listed private dwelling which secure its future use as designated heritage asset could be a public benefit. So maintenance now weighs positively in paragraph 196 of the NPPF, which is an exciting prospect, and it gives some more examples there. I'm skipped through this again. There will be a whole gamut of local guidance information to look at when you're in a local area, including lots of information up front and research, as well as strategic advice, as well as Article 4s and some planning tools to look at. Always go to those and they will provide you a lot of information up front. And I think I'm going to avoid this last penultimate slide and go straight to the recap. Understand the significance of your assets, their needs and their potential. Look beyond the building and the contribution to the wider place, community and setting. Look for overlapping heritage designations. Apply all the policies, the favourable ones, don't just look for harm. Sensitive change is supported in policy and legislation, but avoid, minimise and mitigate harm when you can. Leverage development to bring public benefits through conservation and through social, economic and environmental gain, and use local policy, strategic and guidance framework to your advantage. And I think that is me. So I'll pass over to Sarah now. Sarah Harrison from the City of Lincoln Council.
Well, hello. I'm so pleased to be here representing the development management role in heritage-led regeneration. I've been heavily involved in 2 projects I'm going to talk to you today because they're both in conservation areas and they both contain multiple heritage assets. I would talk about Lincoln, but I don't have time, so here's a nice image instead. So my first project is a £40 million regeneration of an area of the lower part of Lincoln based around Sinsel Street and the 2 corn markets. And it's been rebranded as the Cornhill Quarter. Now, Sinsel Street is unique because it's the only commercial street that runs parallel to the High Street in Lincoln. It wasn't developed until quite late after a land sale in 1823, and then it was developed in quite a quick time. So this has created a distinctive character, predominantly red brick. It's quite small scale, quite domestic, and the architecture is quite homogeneous. But it was built to a good quality. We've got some polychromatic brickwork detailing, some oriels, and some feature windows. And it would be reasonable to attribute this to the fact of where it's sat in the City of Lincoln. You can see here on this 1842 map, there's Sinsel Street, and you can see it's separated from the High Street and the Cornhill by a row of buildings, and it's just being developed there. And in this next slide, you can see that the city's decided to construct the 2 corn markets here. We've now got access to the High Street. The rest of that Sinsel Street has been developed. And it's no doubt enjoying the proximity to these high status civic buildings, really, and also the economic benefits of the increased footfall. But things change, fashions change, and just as the corn markets helped launch Sinsel Street, they also contributed to its decline as farmers began to increasingly buy their corn directly from sellers. It lost a lot of its vibrant economy. One of the markets was repurposed as a department store, but they were never as successful as they were in their heyday. And it did include some questionable additions and alterations. But as early as the 1960s, the area was perceived as problematic. The High Street was absorbing most of the shopping, and the footfall had dramatically declined, and probably typical of the time. This master plan took no account of the heritage of the area, and there's wide-scale demolition, and we're going to get a lovely covered mall. But thankfully, this didn't come to pass. But the area continued to experience a decline and really suffered. And we can see, despite the quality of the buildings above ground, at ground level, we can see the consequence of long-term lack of investment. And really, it was caught in that typical downward economic spiral where the landlords try and remedy lack of interest with falling rents, and overall there's a lack of confidence and real confidence in the viability of the area and the potential. And it becomes somewhat sadly neglected, and we've got the usual culprits of we've got lots of historic shop fronts, we have a tangle of wires, we've got lack of maintenance, inappropriate shop fronts with not great materials, we've got deep plastic illuminated boxes, oversized fascia. So basically, the area was a living example of all those how not tos that we get in local authority shopfront guidance. And this is the situation that my colleagues and I inherited about 6 years ago. A shopfront scheme had been submitted and that had gone through, but we did start to talk to the owners about what we could do with the corn market and also some modern buildings on the corner. And that's when I started working with the owners of pretty much the whole area, which is Lincolnshire Co-op. And the first element that I was involved in was the conservation and restoration of the corn market. So you remember it being made into a supermarket. Here are some very lovely suspended ceilings. We had lots of meetings on site with this one, and the main thing was trying to negotiate that we didn't re-ceiling this building and we didn't subdivide it, because although that would have been easier, it was such an opportunity to reveal that wow factor of what this room had looked like. And thankfully that argument was won, and here we have the lovely hammer beam roof in all its glory. Of course, there was compromise, excuse me, although the owners did see the potential of the interiors. This is one of the main compromises. We agreed to the glazing of the first floor blind arcade. Did involve the loss of some of those traditional adverts that were on site, but we felt that the public benefit of increasing the visibility into and out of the building and increased levels of light would really help us achieve the overall success of the project. To counter that, we did manage to keep the adverts on the other side, and they were restored and retained as part of the overall scheme. And we can see them here, they're sat behind the bar. And I hope to agree that the end result is quite stunning. Cozy Club run a very successful bar and restaurant out of the building, and it's really embraced its original architecture as part of their scheme. Very quickly, there's those glazed arcades on the outside, and I think it really actually helps the building to relate better to its surrounding area. There was a new extension went on the side, so quite modest, fairly contemporary design, but using traditional materials, which I thought was really important. And downstairs, very quickly, a lot of the units downstairs, as long as I can remember, were boarded out. And then once we took all that boarding off, we found some real gems like this barrel vaulted ceiling, and we've kept those as part of the new scheme. So the core market really helped us set the tone of what we want to achieve. Here is the shops which we were looking at earlier on that slide, and this is what they looked like at the beginning of the project. And this is the approved scheme that I inherited. So it's not a bad scheme, but it's pretty anodyne, and it's really losing the opportunity to make the most of the architecture on the upper floors. So I had a meeting with the chief exec of the co-op, and she came out of that meeting convinced that this should be a legacy project, that really the historic buildings would be the foundation of a strong vision for what Central Street could be, and get back that distinctive sense of place. And I found some old plans of what shop fronts used to look like. And I think that reinstatement was the right choice. I think that traditional shop fronts are a piece of craftsmanship that they have a specialness that people respond to positively. So I think that the shop fronts we can see here, they speak to people. They have an endless appeal. Their materials, their quality of the proportions and the detail that's gone into it, and they really engender that sense of continuity. So along with the case officer, we had lots of negotiations with the architects and the agents and the joiners, and on a shop-by-shop basis, really, we looked at how we could either do an authentic reinstatement or a really good interpretation. And there were some great wins. And here are some case studies to show just a few of those. This is an ongoing project, so these have been already completed. So here we have the first one, the willow pattern. Used to be a pub. This is what it looked like when I first came onto the job. So you've got some interesting detailing there, the polychromatic brickwork. You have that lovely oriel window, although lots and lots of layers of paint there, which couldn't see much of the detail. We've got a modern shop front at ground floor. The old photo shows us this. We've got a much more decorative oriel treatment. You can really see that polychromatic brickwork, and there's some lovely slender archways on that ground floor. And here we are today. So we've taken back a lot of that paint and reinstalled some of that detail. The new stall risers and the lovely glazed green brick, and also the beautiful arch windows, which were much harder than they look. They've gone back in, and we even pointed up each of those different brickworks in a different colour, so that would really stand out. The next one is this building here, 31 to 30A. So again, we can see here it's a lovely building, but the way it's been treated at ground floor has really divided it up. So you read as two different entities, and it's obviously really poorly done. There's hardly anything left of the original shop front. And here we are today. We've refurbished the windows on the upper floors, and we've used what was left of the pilasters to inform how we treated the ground floor. This little one here, now this one was a compromise because it would be where the new entry through to a car park up the rear would be. So we always knew that this was going to lose its ground floor. Unfortunately, it had this very special arrangement of rainwater goods and the windows, and we didn't really know what to do with this because it was just so bad looking, and the bricks were terribly worn as well. Then we found this photo, and we had this great oriel window, which completely lifts the whole building and balances out what we've got happening on the willow pattern. And this is what we managed to achieve, which we were so pleased about. It looks like it's been there forever. We had to render it because the bricks were so bad, but here's a picture of that oriel in the joiner's workshop, just to give you an idea about scale, and also to say that in these jobs, having some joiners who really rise to the challenge of the myriad of challenges that these sort of projects throw up and enjoy it and will work with you is worth its weight in gold. So the next one is this little one on the end. This again is a shop that's been divided into two separate entities with particularly nasty shop front and wires and all sorts of accretions on the front. We use this as one of our key guides on how to reinstate traditional shop front, and we'll just make a note of those fluted pilasters. There they are again in the shop, and there's the whole thing. Now apparently I chose that colour, but I really wish I hadn't because I'm not sure about it now. But anyway, the whole thing looks a lot better. And so we have before and we have now, which just illustrates as well how important cumulative impact can be. Now, another really exciting element of this whole project was the opportunity to have some new build. These are some 1980s buildings. I don't think they respond really well to context. They aren't aging well, and I think their replacement was an essential part of the scheme because it gave us two key opportunities. So this is what we have today, an Everyman Cinema, which is lovely, by the way, you should go. We have raised the height, so it answers the corn market on the other side, and it also provides a more convincing sort of architectural pivot point in that corner and a robust view stop. The other one was the old buildings really encroached into the space, and we felt there's opportunity here to present a really good town square. So we took that building line back. You can see here how well those two roofscapes work together, and we used that wonderful apsidal end of the corn market to provide a focal point, and this, along with some really good quality hard landscaping, has become a really successful piece of new townscape, really, and it's really well used. And we have some great views from the terrace, and they're looking towards the cathedral. So perhaps unusually for this project, this has all been privately financed by the co-op, but we've achieved a heritage grant quality outcome. I mean, we were involved with the roof slates, door handles, everything. And I think that to do that, we had to have a really good working relationship, which we did with the owners. There was definitely a good level of trust on both sides. And so, you know, the expert advice and the facilitating role of the planning department with an enlightened owner means that we've got this very successful project. Almost all the tenants are trading either at or above their expected margins, which I think is fantastic news in the current climate. And obviously nothing breeds confidence like success. So this is an ongoing long-term investment, and the shop fronts are still happening. And maybe next time I do this talk, there'll be more to show you. So now to something quite different. This is the old deanery up in the cathedral. This is a cathedral connected project. This is a Heritage Lottery Fund project of about 12 million to create a new visitor centre, cafe, shop, community space, and learning facilities based around the old deanery, which until recently had been part of Lincoln Minster School. It's a pretty, yes?
Sorry to interrupt. I'm conscious that we're just whizzing through the time really quickly. So could we
Right.
go through
I'm
this
done.
Fab, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so this is the as it was, and this is the artist impression. Simpson's brows of the architect, they were really good. And we can do some good before and after, during, and there we are today. It's been completed, and just to quickly go, you can see there how close that was to the original artist impression. There's the new link building going towards the cathedral. These are just some really good befores and afters, so we can just whiz. There's the exhibition space. You have a solid wall on one side because we want the only light to come in from the top. There's the playground being taken up, and there's the exhibition space ready for the Romanesque frieze. And that's how we treated that solid wall from the inside, using these bronze panels, which I thought worked really well. Again, view before, view after. There's that link building, which is right next to the Wren doorway, and that's looking through into the new building from the really lovely conservation work they did inside the old deanery, with a view towards the Dean's doorway, which I think is really important. There's a lovely overall view, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. So I can now hand you on to John Millhouse, who will be doing the next presentation. Thank you.
Hey, I hope you can hear me, everybody. Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to Adam as well. I enjoy both of your presentations very much, and I hope you find this presentation equally as interesting. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about a project I was involved with at John Smedley Limited, the world-famous knitwear factory in Derbyshire. The project involved the redevelopment of surplus land and buildings at their factory site to create 26 new dwellings through a combination of new build and conversion. The application was submitted in 2015. On behalf of the company, we acted as planning and heritage advisors alongside architects Evans Vittori. The permission was granted in December of that year. The company have since sold the development site onto a developer, and development is well underway. Okay. So to give you some context, the mills the factory is the oldest continuously manufacturing factory in the world. It was established in 1784, initially as a cotton spinning mill. Very quickly became a wool spinning mill, which persists to this day.
Hi John, can you just put your presentation on the screen, please?
Is it not there?
We can't see it.
Okay, my apologies. Can you see it now? Can you see it, Lynette?
Not yet. I think carry on and we will get it sorted.
I think perhaps I didn't see the icon requiring me to share screen. Perhaps that's the problem.
If you carry on talking through it, and we'll work out how to get the presentation up for everyone.
Okay, not to worry. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, so the factory expanded through the 19th century and reached its peak in terms of production in the 1930s. And like many textile businesses, there was a sharp decline in the second half of the 20th century in the face of foreign competition. There's been something of a revival in recent years with the opening of 2 flagship central London stores and worldwide online sales. However, it's very difficult, as you might imagine, to run a textile company in the UK in this day and age, particularly with an extensive and aging building stock like John Smedley's have. So the application we submitted was very much about raising capital investment to help keep the company trading into the future. Okay, so John Smedley's is situated in the Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site. The World Heritage Site runs from the Silk Mill in Derby at its southern end up to Arkwright's Mills at Cromford, northern end. And the World Heritage Site, or the Derwent Valley, should I say, saw the birth of the factory system in Britain, the first mills of their type and associated workers' communities. And John Smedley's is actually the last working textile mill in the Derwent Valley. Okay, so the proposals involved the redevelopment of what was known as the East site, which was part of the factory complex, which had become surplus to requirements. Now, the scheme included the conversion of some roadfront mill buildings to apartments, and the demolition of other buildings to the rear of the site to allow the erection of a new terrace of 2-storey houses, the conversion of one of the oldest buildings at the factory site, the late 18th century mill building to apartments as well, the demolition of an adjacent mid 19th century building to facilitate that, and finally the construction of a new 3-storey terrace on a greenfield area just to the north. Okay, I'm not sure if you can see these slides, but we have in front of me anyway a nice image of Lee Road, which is the road running through the factory site, and the buildings converted or were to be converted to apartments.
John, can you just, sorry to interrupt again, can you just see if you've minimised the presentation on your screen and then share it if you can find it? It would be lovely to see the images as you're talking through them.
I'd very much like to share them. I think I'm. Oh, here we go.
Amazing. Well done. Thanks, John.
I'm very sorry, everybody.
Massive sigh of relief. Thank you.
My apologies. Would you like me to start over? Quickly run through? I won't say everything again, but I'll run through the slides, shall I?
I think, yeah, go on, whiz through, give us the highlights and then catch up to where we were talking about.
Of course. My apologies, everybody. Okay, so here we are. So yes, John Smedley's and world famous knitwear factory. And just to recap, the scheme involved 26 new dwellings through a combination of conversion and new build, surplus land and buildings that the company no longer required for its production, but it was very much about raising capital investment for the company, keeping the company trading, and like Adam said, the heritage benefits of John Smedley's continuing as a working textile mill in the Derwent Valley were very much recognised. So it wasn't just about finding new uses for the individual buildings, but actually helping John Smedley's to survive and thrive. And I had some old pictures of the mills. Not much social distancing going on here, but as you can see, John Smedley's has traditionally employed a lot of people. Aerial view of the factory site, and as you can see, it expanded significantly. The east site that I was talking about is a sort of bottom left of the screen there. So yeah, the Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site, which I mentioned, you can see where John Smedley's lies in relation to that geographically along at the northern end of the Derwent Valley there. And there's a bit of a site plan. The east site on Lee Road, with the remainder of the factory on the side of the road there. And yes, the proposals in summary: conversion of buildings, mill buildings to apartments, demolition of some buildings at the back to facilitate that and also allow some new build, and a new build at the northern end on a greenfield area to help fund development. There is the picture of Lee Road with the iconic John Smedley Bridge. The buildings to be converted on the right hand side. The architect's proposals, here's a model of those roadfront buildings I mentioned there to be converted to apartments. The original scheme included a cut-out of the central roof section with the intention of creating roof terraces. Unfortunately, the developer had to drop that particular element of the proposal on cost grounds. I guess that's an indication of the expense of converting historic buildings. Okay, here's a picture of the back of the east side after demolition. The buildings at the front there awaiting conversion. Now, here is a mill building with conversion underway. This is the building perpendicular to the road, late 18th century mill building, one of the earliest buildings on the John Smedley site. Conversion nearly finished on site today. Now, the proposal also included a commitment to restore these historic cottages on the opposite side of the John Smedley complex, actually within the neighbouring planning authority area in a different council area altogether, but not far away. 106 legal agreement included with the application the restoration of these buildings. Very important part of the overall scheme, and the buildings are Grade 2 listed, classic Derwent Valley mill workers cottages, late 18th century, early 19th century. As you can see, though, they were in an incredibly dilapidated state. They were on the Heritage at Risk register at the time. As well as the restoration of the cottages, the 106 agreement included obligations for John Smedley to pay £50,000 towards apprenticeship and staff training programmes, and another £50,000 towards the establishment of an archive to house their extensive collection of textile garments. So those monies were to be paid from the proceeds of the development. In fact, they have been paid. That's all been done. Those payments were not requested by the council, but we offered them as part of the package on behalf of John Smedley's, really to demonstrate the company's commitment to funding worthwhile projects. And the council were in turn able to take that into account when they considered the planning balance. Now, the scheme sadly did involve some demolition to facilitate the conversion of other buildings. This was underpinned by careful consideration of the significance of various buildings on site. The brick buildings, for example, were the ones at the back of the east site that were very much in the way of enabling the conversion of the more significant road front buildings, and also being at the back of the site, it would have been very difficult to repurpose them to another use. So they were 1930s buildings. They included production areas historically, and also the old staff canteen. So unfortunately they had to be removed, but they did have a social history of their own. And I recall when researching the project finding an old invitation to the opening banquet of the staff canteen. So that was recognised. The other building that was unfortunately demolished was the top left-hand side of the screen there, the warehouse building, which it was mid 19th century. It adjoined the earlier late 18th century mill building, which I mentioned earlier, which was to be converted, and it was felt by the architect necessary to remove the Victorian building in order to facilitate the conversion of the adjacent building, which was more significant, and it was a tough decision. The building had an important role in the traditional operation of the factory. It was where the wool was stored and then lowered down on a pulley system to the remainder of the factory site. I did propose to the architect that perhaps we could have retained the front section of the building where the pulley used to be, and obviously the most prominent element from the road. He felt strongly that the whole building needed to be removed, but he did in the end retain some of the front facade to maintain the street scene there. So difficult decisions, but understandable ones. The proposal also included some new build. This is a proposed sketch of the three-storey terrace on the grassy area to the north, and this was definitely the most contentious element of the planning. There were objections received from the three houses adjacent to the site, but we felt that it was really important to the viability of the scheme, so we presented to the planning authority some costings and valuations to demonstrate that this was needed to fund the restoration of the older buildings, and so it proved to be the case. Actually, the development has gone over budget, and these buildings were absolutely essential, as it turned out. This is the outcome. These are the terrace properties that have been built. They're basically a modern take on a late 18th century workers cottage, and they've sold extremely well. They've received a REBA award as well for the design. I think they've worked out really successfully. An interesting point, during the course of the application, the planning officer did suggest to me at one point lowering the buildings to 2-storey, given the objections from neighbouring residents. But the architect stood firm and said no, they really have to be 3-storey buildings to properly reflect the historic workers' cottages and to continue the canyon effect along Lee Road. And I think that was the right decision. I think they'd be much weaker architecturally had they been lowered as part of a planning compromise. Here are the cottages, the before and after. John Smedley's retained ownership of the cottages, and they did an absolutely outstanding job in restoring the buildings. Received much amendment from the Durham Heritage Site Partnership, from Historic England. They won awards themselves, but they did again cost a lot more than John Smedley's originally anticipated. So here are the cottages in context. This is actually the southern end of the factory site, the most prominent part of the site from the main road. And John Smedley's sort of 5 years on do have other aspirations for this end of the site. They would rather like to establish a new factory shop and visit the centre at this end of the site, and would quite like to use the cottages to house their archive and collection of historic garments. But the 106 agreement I mentioned did state that the cottages have to be let out as social rented affordable houses. The trigger point has not yet been reached for that. That's when a certain number of houses are sold on the east site development. But that's what will have to happen. It's legally binding in the 106 agreement. So a bit of a conundrum for the company in that respect. Okay, so lessons learned. Looking back, there are quite a few lessons learned from the experience. I think that the restoration of the cottages was extremely rewarding. Here we are at the opening ceremony. But like I said, they did cost more. A significant proportion of the funds generated for John Smedley by the sale of the east side did go into the restoration of the cottages. The conversions themselves did cost more as well. The developer found unexpected issues with the ground conditions, freshwater springs under the factory buildings, that sort of thing. So our hunch that the 3-storey new build development was required to fund the remainder has proven to be the case. Had it not been for that new build element, I don't think that the development would have stacked up at all, actually. So thankfully it's been viable thanks to those new build buildings. The 106 agreement, the payments towards the apprenticeship scheme and the archive, as well as obviously the cottages, I think that's worked out really well. Those payments have been made to great effect within the business. That was a very imaginative and novel approach to a Section 106 agreement, I feel. And looking back, I'm not sure if 5 years down the line, many local authorities would accept that sort of an approach. I feel that authorities are having to be increasingly risk averse from a legal perspective, which is a shame, I feel. And I'm also not sure whether such an approach would be accepted in the future, given the government's white paper and intention to simplify the planning system. But overall, I think it was a successful project, and I think the best outcome of all is that John Smedley's is still a working textile mill in the Derwent Valley, so it's living history there, and I think the heritage benefits of that are immeasurable. So that more or less concludes my presentation. Just a quick mention for the architects who did a great job, and John Smedley's themselves, who we still work for today. Please buy a John Smedley jumper. We can keep them going for another 250 years, hopefully. My contact details there, should you want to contact me, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. That was great, really interesting. Thank you to everyone for bearing with while we got the presentation sorted. We're all fairly novice at this, so thank you very much. I'm conscious that we have gone over time quite a bit, but I hope you'd agree it was worth it because the presentations we've had have been really interesting, and I'd love to see the images of what's happened and what's changed, and really interesting use of Section 106 monies there.